think it's going to be a highly, I think we're going to have a highly topical, it's going to be a highly topical issue moving forward. Now, for the purposes of our discussion today, what is hybrid working? Well, we are working on the basis that hybrid working is a mixture of working from home and a mixture of working in the office or the normal workplace. So that could be 1 day at home, 4 days at home, whatever, it could be a mixture. I think it's also important to say that we're not coming at this from an evangelical perspective. We absolutely accept that some organisations it will work, some organisations it will not work. And in the context of some organisations, it might work for some employees, but won't work for other employees. Now, I'm fortunate to work in a whole host of different sectors, advising clients in different sectors, do a lot of work with schools, manufacturing, engineering, those sorts of companies. So it may well be that individuals can work from home, but not others within that, or they can work on a hybrid basis. It also no detrimental impact on productivity. 71% saying no detrimental impact on productivity. Breaking that down, 33% stated that productivity had actually improved. 38% said it was unchanged. That's obviously how you got to your 71%. And only 23% felt that it had decreased. Now, I once again caveat that by saying that would very much depend on the specific industry and sector that you are in. Another example might be better motivation. And a number of surveys have showed that employees can be better motivated when they have got more of a mixture of work-life balance, again, working from home and the workplace. The other, I think, big point that I wanted to make was retention and recruitment. What I would say from my own professional experience is that the genie's out the bottle on this. And it's going to be very hard, I think, for many employers to put that genie back in the bottle, if not impossible. So I think it's going to be much more likely that there will be an expectation on the part of employees that they will be able to have a more flexible working pattern, as we call it, hybrid. And I think certainly in recruitment, we've been going through a recruitment process recently. And one of the first questions that was asked by potential employees that we were looking at was, will it be possible for them to work a balance from home and work? Now, if we went back, say, 5, even 3 years ago, I think the amount of times that it would be much less likely that we'll be asked that question. So I think retention and recruitment is a very, very important point moving forward on this. The other point was organisational resilience. This may be in relation to, for example, weather issues. It might be in relation to roadworks, problems on the trains. And of course, if people are able to work more from home, then in those particular circumstances, they will be less affected or adversely affected in those circumstances. Probably not the most important point, but nonetheless, I think worth raising. What about the drawbacks? Very briefly, because time is marching on. Many employers are uncomfortable about the potential loss of culture. The whole issue around collaboration. Could it be that social interaction is reduced, well-being is reduced, and maybe innovative thinking is reduced? The whole management approach will need to change. It's a different form of management, which I obviously had to encounter myself, where we're managing members of your team and staff that are actually operating from home. It's a different way of managing. Learning and development, I think, is an important point. And that, from my own experience, is particularly difficult for junior members of staff or trainees who often benefit from working alongside more experienced member of staff, almost a teacher, so to speak. So I think that can be an issue, particularly for junior staff. Productivity we've raised, although the survey, the recent surveys do suggest on the whole, that's more of a positive thing than a negative thing. Data security is something which my colleague Tessa is going to talk about in some detail and confidentiality. Inclusivity and mental health are other big issues. And certainly, I mean, Amanda and I and my colleague Karen Cook, we're all trained mental health first aiders, and we've all had more experience of that in the last 18 months of talking to employees, because there have been issues generally around people working from home and mental health issues. However, I think that will be reduced with the more hybrid working model. I think that was more an issue when people felt isolated at home with not having the benefit of, say, coming into the workplace 2 or 3 times a week. That's certainly my hope and my expectation. So how is hybrid working triggered? Really in 2 forms. One is the employer, one is the employee. Now, obviously, in the case of Furley Page and many of my clients, or our clients, it's been employer-led. Employers have flirted with the idea of moving towards this new model. And what they have done is often carry out staff surveys, ascertain where people are, what they want to do, what would be an ideal working model for them. So they're listening to their staff. We did that. We had a survey last September 2020, and we had a further survey in May of this year. Our staff were very clearly telling us that they wanted to move and trial the new form of hybrid working, and we have listened to what they've said. If you're a larger employee with big employee representative groups or even recognising trade unions, we would advise that you also speak with and consult with your employee representatives and trade unions. But listen to what people are saying, and you'll get a lot more back out of that, I would suggest. Of course, if it's not the employer introducing, then you have the option for an employee to request under the flexible working regulations, which I suspect all of you are familiar with. And there is obviously statutory guidance there in the Employment Rights Act, and most employers mirror that in terms of their own staff handbooks, etc. And you'll all be familiar that an employee must be employed for at least 26 weeks. That could be any employee who's been employed for at least 26 weeks. So the actual motivation for making a flexible working request is no longer relevant as it was when it was first introduced around childcare and caring responsibilities. That's no longer required. And you could not make an application if you've made one in the last 12 months. Now, what I would say, and I was talking to Tessa about this the other day, is that we feel that whilst the law has not changed, we do feel that we must be very mindful that tribunals may be more sympathetic to employees in the light of the last 18 months. So if an employee is making an application and it's refused, I think that it's going to be a harder defence for an employer now to defend what's called the indirect sex discrimination form of claim, because I think the direction of travel here is against the employer simply saying no, even if they are relying upon one of the statutory grounds. And there was a very recent, very highly publicised case of Alice Thompson and an estate agent called Manners, where she had asked for, she wanted a 4-day week moving from 5 to 4, and she wanted to leave at 5 p.m. rather than at 6 p.m. simply because of her childcare requirements. And she was successful on the grounds of indirect sex discrimination and was awarded £185,000. It was only at employment tribunal level, but I just think it highlights the potential dangers of an employee, not an employer, not taking these issues seriously. So I think the direction of travel may be moving in relation to employee requests. Now, my final point that I wanted to make relates to employment contracts and policies. What I would say is a number of my clients have recently, or our clients have come to us and said, if we are introducing a more flexible hybrid working model, then it may be an opportune time to look at our employment contracts and update them. And what I would say is that these are just some of the points that I think an employer would want to look at in terms of updating their employment contracts. So place of work would be a very obvious one if it is that an individual is working both in the office and at home. And I think it is important to make minimum expectations of what is required. So if it's 3 days in the office, 2 days at home, I think that should be specified. You might also want to consider a geographical remit. I'm not particularly supportive of that, but if it is that people are traveling in from long distances, it might be that some employers are uncomfortable about that. Hours of work, I think, is another important point to monitor. There is quite a lot of evidence that people are actually working longer hours when they're at home. And I think that we need to be very mindful of that. And as I said, in terms of the productivity surveys, that's been spelled out. Salary and benefits, there has been some quite high publicised issues around the Home Office and Google that are potentially looking, or have, I think it's potentially at this stage, looking to reduce salary for those that are working from home. I'd be very careful not to go down that route. I mean, there are issues around London waiting, etc. What you don't want to do is to sort of create a two-tier workforce. It may be in due course that salaries don't go up as much, but at the moment, I'd be very mindful not to look to reduce salaries and benefits. Expenses, so for example, broadband, heating, those sorts of things, telephone lines, there is no statutory right to that, and an employee would only be entitled to it if it is that there was consent or contractual right from the employer in relation to that. And finally, in my whistle-stop tour, I just wanted to encourage you, if you do want to go down this route, to introduce hybrid working and maybe a home working policy. So the hybrid working could look at some of the conditions that you might impose for this. So if there are performance issues, you might want to bring people back in on a more regular basis. You want to look at, say, health and safety, which Tessa's going to cover, equipment and suitable workspace, confidentiality, insurance requirements, potentially data security. So a whole host of issues that you might want to embody in a policy. So that was all I wanted to say in terms of my slides. So I don't know if there are any questions that have arisen in my whistle-stop tour.
Thank you, Andrew. That was really, really interesting. We haven't had any questions as yet. Oh, hold on one moment. A question has just come up. Alice Monk is asking, any advice on people working from home with children at home, for example, in the school holidays? Would it be wise to put this into the policies? I mean,
it's all about consultation, isn't it, between employee and employer. I mean, obviously, a number of our solicitors have children, and I don't, it was a very difficult period, I think, for some when there was the balancing of homeschooling and client requirements. It's all about looking at the longer term retention issues. And I think the question is right. It may well be something which employers should be consulting and looking at on an individual basis, I think, rather than a collective basis. But I think that would be good management and a better way of retaining people. And it goes back really to one of my earlier points about benefits. A good question, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice, for asking the question. Thank you, Andrew. We haven't had any other questions at the moment, but I will be keeping an eye on the chat. So you're welcome to hand over to the next speaker from Furley Page.
Hi everybody. So I have been given the lovely task of talking about data protection for you all. I feel like I've got the graveyard slot a little bit, but it is obviously a major issue when working from home. Helpfully, the Information Commissioner's Office have put together a very comprehensive guidance for organisations, and I very much implore people to read through this because it is very, very useful. I've popped the link on the screen so you can take a little note of it, but also if you just go on the ICO's website and put in working from home, this guidance will come up. Within there, you have several different sections. There's a section on security checklists for employers, so things you can do to make sure all your data remains secure. I'll go through some of those in a moment. There's an entire section on bring your own device to work. So if your employees are using their own mobile phones and laptops, the considerations that people need to take with those. There's 10 tips on working from home remotely as well. And if you want a very quick overview, I would say that's the guidance to read. It's very succinct. And again, I'll go through some of those to give you a bit of the flavour today. And very specifically, and it is in video form, video conferencing and the issues to look out for, which is somewhat topical with today. And I'll just mention a couple of those when we go on. What I do kind of want to bring to people's attention, though, is that data protection obligations on employers are very much a positive obligation. You can't kind of sit back and think you can just rely on people's logic to keep data secure and confidential information. You do have to take proactive steps to explain to people what they need to do. And in order for you to explain to people what they need to do, you need to identify the risks involved with home working. So the first thing the ICO tell everybody to do is carry out a data protection impact assessment for your business, because the risks associated with data protection will depend on the sector you're in, the type of work you do, and the type of work each individual does. And once you identify those risks, that impact assessment has to show how you can mitigate those risks. And I'm kind of going to go through some of the main ones the ICO recommend for most businesses to give you a flavour of actually the risks that are likely to come up and how you can deal with those. So the first thing people recommend, and I hope most of you do this when working from home, systems do seem to have changed to this, is have a multi-factor authentication login sequence. Essentially, that means more than just a password. So again, at Furley Page, we've implemented this. You put your username, password in, and then you have to click authenticate, and we go to a mobile phone and then have to click yes, authorize the login. And only then do we get into our systems. So it just stops if somebody happens to hack your password, there's still a second level of security before they can even access your systems. So it's very basic, but IT should hopefully be able to put that into place. Something not many employers have considered, because in offices, all networks are very secure, you rely on your IT teams to make sure hackers can't get in, is what happens with people's home networks. They're generally not as secure, don't have as many measures in place. And the ICO have been very clear that actually employers should tell people to change their Wi-Fi passwords regularly. It's quite unlikely that you'll have a hacker sitting next door trying to get into your network, but certain industries are being targeted more. And if you have a face online and it gets out where you live, it is possible that people will hack local networks and just chance their luck. So a very simple measure, change your Wi-Fi password every couple of months or something, and make sure people have home software security to stop malware attacks. So simple measures, you will always have them in the office, but make sure employees do the same at home. Secure storage. If you are dealing with hard copy, personal data, confidential information, what do you do with that at home? I know many of us are working paperless or as far as we can these days, but it's inevitable that some people do have confidential information and personal data at home. So an example for us, we work completely paperless now, but if I'm on a phone call with a client, I will sit there and take notes, hard copy notes. I will then pop those onto the system. But what do I do with that hard copy note if I'm at home? And the ICO says quite specifically, you have to lock it away if you're going to keep it. It's not enough to just keep it in a room where you don't think anyone else goes. It has to be under lock and key, or you destroy it. So have a shredder, burn it, whatever it may be. But you do have to tell people to do that. Again, with the question that came up before, children at home, it raises a thing of what happens with your computers. You might step away from your desk to nip to make a cup of tea or something. And if you've got family at home, particularly if it's not a work laptop and they think it's a family computer, they might nip on and access the systems and accidentally see personal data. So again, very simple measure, just make sure your staff either lock their computers, or if it's a lunch break, log out of the systems and log back in to stop people accidentally seeing things on the screen. This one sounds obvious, but as employment lawyers, we know people don't necessarily use their logic. So again, do tell people only use work systems, don't work outside of those and store data on your own laptops, your own devices. Sometimes people do this if there's been a crash of work systems and they go, oh, well, I need to get this work done and send it out. Make sure you clearly communicate that that should not be done, and if it absolutely has to be done for work purposes, get authorization from your company so they can mitigate any risk, and then make sure that data is deleted later on. Ironically, I have not done this in today's call, but if you have any photos or anything in the background or files for clients, blur out your backgrounds for your video calls. I mean, I have nothing in the background that is photos, personal data or anything. But if you can use a setting to just blur out your background in video calls, and it just avoids the risk that you accidentally reveal someone's personal data or confidential information. And again, this one has been quite difficult throughout the pandemic, when obviously everybody has been told to work from home, but the ICO are very much telling employers that just because that is the case doesn't mean that your employees shouldn't try to keep confidential calls confidential. So go and take a phone call in at least a separate room and close the door if that's the least you can do. You have to try and take basic steps still to keep calls confidential and not have people overhear you. So, I mean, a lot of these are logical, but people are not logical. And that's why the ICO say you have to expressly tell people what their obligations are. And throughout the pandemic, we have seen people become a little bit more relaxed about these measures. Employers might have told people at the start, and then people have kind of been bumbling through. But now home working is becoming permanent, or at least the hybrid working seems to be the most common. This is the time to refresh the knowledge for your employees and reiterate what their obligations are. And as Andrew said, the best place to do this is either within a home working policy or update your data protection policy and bring that to their attention again. So that's kind of the whistle stop of what you want to tell your employees to do. And perhaps slightly more interesting is the topic of monitoring. This has very much been in the press the last few months. Some very large organisations have said their employees are working from home permanently, but in order to ensure they are actually doing what they say they are, they want to introduce monitoring. And as Andrew said, actually productivity doesn't seem to have gone down. So it's going to be quite difficult to justify monitoring. And I kind of want to go through the legal steps you will have to be able to show in order to get away with monitoring, essentially legally. But before I do that, I kind of wanted to show how unpopular this is likely to be with your employees. There was a poll last year, I think it was a union that did it, and 80% of employees said they would be uncomfortable with camera monitoring. They felt it would be incredibly intrusive to have basically be videoed their entire workday. 66% said they wouldn't like keystroke monitoring, because essentially all that's showing is that they're at their desk typing. They might not be doing work, and they felt that was very kind of archaic and showed a lack of trust in them. And I've actually put the nicest statistic here about damaging the employment relationship. 48% of workers on average said it would damage the relationship because of that trust point and the extra stress it would show. But interestingly, once you got to the younger workforce, and that was like under 35s in this survey, it went up to 65 to 70% said it would damage the relationship. So it does very much kind of show the change in thought and attitudes and cultures with age differences. People are expecting to be able to work from home and think, actually, if there hasn't been any problem, as the statistics Andrew went through showed, why do you want to monitor me? And they think that just shows a complete lack of trust and would damage the relationship. So before we even get into the legality, you've really got to think of whether you want to introduce this from the relationship side of things. So it's kind of food for thought there before you even get into data protection and all that side. But then once you do, there are two things you have to consider. So there's the data protection side, which I'll come on to. But the main one is that people still have the right to privacy in their workplace. And that is going to be slightly higher when that workplace is at home. And case law has said that the balancing with monitoring and the right to privacy has to be decided in accordance with what we call the doctrine of proportionality. So to comply with the doctrine of proportionality, there's three things employers need to consider. The first one is that you have to identify a legitimate objective in order to monitor. So what do you want to consider? Is it to ensure people are not lying about the work hours they're in front of their computer? Do you have performance concerns, which means you want to monitor them? What is that objective? And then you have to ensure that it's sufficiently important to justify the monitoring and limiting the right to privacy. So if you can't identify that there have been any issues, it's probably not important enough at that moment in time to justify the monitoring. And then you have to finally, and this is where the proportionality comes in, you have to ensure that the method you choose to monitor people is no more than necessary to meet that objective. So do you need to have cameras on people all day long, every single day to ensure they are doing their job? Probably not. And when you kind of break that down, you realise how difficult it's going to be to justify some of these methods that employers want to introduce. From the data protection side, the ICO have helpfully put an employment practices code together, and it's part 3 of this code that deals with the data protection side of monitoring. I've got the link on there again, but if you go on the ICO website and type in employment practices code, it will come up. And this contains specific good practice recommendations that employers should consider if they want to introduce monitoring. And again, with all data protection, you have to do an impact assessment in order to justify it and show why you are doing this type of monitoring. And in reality, it's very similar to the doctrine of proportionality. It's that same logical approach that you have to go through. You have to identify the purpose behind the monitoring and the benefits that are likely to be delivered. So I suppose the benefit to the employer will be ensuring people are complying with their contracts and performing to standard. You then have to identify any adverse impact of the monitoring. So will it make people overtly stressed? Does it actually infringe on their right to privacy in the home place? You have to consider those points. And then you have to consider alternatives. So this is the point with data protection. If you're collating data on an individual, you have to do it in the least intrusive manner possible to comply with the GDPR. So if your aim is to monitor people's performance, are there other ways to do it other than an archaic keystroke monitoring? Could you actually have a conversation with people each week to make sure they're getting through their workload and performing to standard? Quite likely. So it's going to be quite rare that actually these basic monitoring things are going to be required. You then need to consider some obligations arising from monitoring. So who do you need to tell that you are doing the monitoring? If you're working in an industry where you want to record videos, it's not just your employees you have to tell that's being recorded, it's your customers as well. And we've all been on the phone and you say this call might be recorded for monitoring purposes. Those sorts of things need to be in place. And then once you've gone through all of that, you need to make an overall assessment as to whether you can justify that monitoring. And we have had a few clients start to ring us and we're saying, as a general rule, general monitoring is going to be very difficult to justify. And you then have to kind of think about when you might want to introduce it. And this is where a privacy notice comes in. And there's one point in particular I wanted to make clear in here. You have to tell people when that monitoring is taking place. And the main question that's coming out of this is, well, a lot of the time we're not one of those employers who's going to monitor people 24/7, but we want to put in our notice that we may do it from time to time if we have performance concerns. And there's a grey area at the moment as to whether that is sufficient or not. And the ICO have not issued clear guidance on this yet, but the general thinking and school of thought behind it is that it won't be, because you could issue a privacy notice to somebody 4 years prior, never have done any monitoring, so that individual has no expectation that that's ever actually taken place, and then want to monitor. So if you've noticed one individual hasn't been performing and you want to introduce monitoring for a period of time, you then have to tell them at that time it arises. So it's kind of areas that are developing as home working is developing, and we are hoping that this practice code will get updated in due course. They are collating extra data and feedback from companies. But bear in mind that a privacy notice has to be actively communicated to your staff. It can't just sit there quietly on the intranet with the hope that they have read it. This is something you have to actively go through, share your impact assessments and inform people what data you're collecting, who you're sharing it with and for what purpose. Kind of very conscious of the time. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through data protection, but I do want to touch on health and safety as well before I pass on. Generally people, the health and safety executive has turned a bit of a blind eye to things and working from home through the pandemic because it was an emergency situation and people had to adapt very, very quickly. But bear in mind that the Health and Safety at Work Act does require employers to ensure that so far as is reasonably practicable, and that's something to bear in mind, the reasonably practical element, you have to ensure a safe workplace. At present, we don't, again, because it's been such a quick change, well, I say quick change around, they put together, the Health and Safety Executive and ACAS, some guidance that was very much geared around the pandemic. So it wasn't geared to a permanent situation, but it does give you an idea of things you need to consider as to what might be reasonably practicable. But what I would say is if you did risk assessments for people 18 months ago, now this is becoming a permanent arrangement rather than temporary, you would want to redo those risk assessments and make sure that actually if people are permanently working from home on some basis, you've reviewed the equipment they've got, you've reminded them of their obligations in relation to setting up their desk correctly and everything. So go through those guidance points because they are very helpful. But there's other things you need to consider. It's not just the physical side of things. So for example, stress and mental health. And I know Andrew touched on the fact that actually people are working longer hours. That's a health and safety concern. And I actually once worked for a company where we all had mobile phones where you could access emails all night long, and the company noticed people were still sending emails at like 11, 12 at night. And they actually introduced a measure where they cut us off 8 o'clock in the evening, we could no longer work. And that kind of ensured the home and work life had that cut off and gave people that balance they need to ensure they rested. It was quite a strong thing, and apparently lawyers aren't good at turning off our phones and not working late, but it did the job. So it's things like that. If you're noticing people are working longer hours, you might want to consider introducing something like that on the systems, like you can't log in beyond a certain time. Equipment as well, this goes down as far as lighting in people's rooms. So don't just think it's the screen that you need to consider. It is basics and reminding people that they need to sit in a well-lit room, not in the dark. Their screens need to be not too bright, not too dim, all those sorts of things. It's reminding people of those obligations, because when they're in the office, you know when a light bulb has gone in the room, but when you're at home, you don't. So it's simple things. But again, if somebody does get eye strain as a result and you haven't done another risk assessment, you could become liable for any injury. I was reading about accidents and first aid, and there was one article I read which recommended all employers gave all employees a first aid kit at home because it's a workplace and they're still responsible. I personally thought that went a bit far, that you had to hand out plasters to everybody in case they cut their finger. But it did just kind of go to show that actually the balance still hasn't been struck as to how far is reasonably practicable. And some people are going on the side of absolute caution. I do think that's over the top, but what you should say to people is, look, if you have an accident at home, say they've tripped over their wire for their laptop or something, they need to report it, because you need to ensure that they are setting up their workspace how you've told them to do it and safe. I mean, if they've tripped over in the garden hanging their washing up at lunchtime, they don't need to report that, but accidents in the workplace do need to be reported. So make sure there's clear guidance about when and how to do that. And then just very briefly, before I take questions and we hand on over, one of the main questions coming out is, of course, if people are working from home, there's a lot of screen work, and I'm going to do this very generalised. It's a lot of office workers work from home. You do obviously have health and safety requirements in relation to screens that people are using. And now this has become a permanent way of work. This kind of raises the practical question of how do you make sure that the screens people are using do comply with health and safety and the risks are lessened, so they're of the right quality, they're furthest away. Do you buy people 2 sets of equipment? I mean, not many companies are going to want to do that because their pockets aren't endless. It's only going to be the massive multinational companies who could afford that. But if you are encouraging people to work from home as a hybrid working, you might end up in a situation where somebody says, well, actually, I don't have the right equipment. So do you then end up with this hierarchical issue where actually managers who could afford to buy the equipment can work from home, juniors who might not be able to afford can't, because you say, well, we can't buy it, you're coming into the office. So as much as it's a health and safety basis, it does then give rise to practical questions. And what's going to be right for one employer is going to be very different for another employer. And that's going to be a management decision that has to take place. Once you've identified and gone through those risk assessments with people, you'll be able to see if there is going to be a major problem with that. I mean, I could talk all day on data protection and health and safety, and I'm very conscious I've reached and gone over slightly my allotted time, and I don't want to encroach on Amanda, so I'll stop there. If anyone does have any questions, obviously just let us know, even if it's after. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Tessa. That was absolutely fascinating, and I know everyone was really engaged with that particular session as well as Andrew's. There is one question from Pam Milton. Does a risk assessment have to be undertaken on site in the worker's home to assess risk? So just picking up on what you were saying about that home working.
No, that would be beyond what's probably reasonably practicable for an employer to go to everybody's house. So what most employers are doing is sending out the expectations. So make sure you have a clear workspace, you don't have piles of boxes behind you. Your desk should be set up with your chair at this height, screen at that height, and make people go through and tick. I think a lot of companies do this electronically these days, and you can actually get that risk assessment from the Health and Safety Executive website and send that to employers. And then as long as you get them to respond and it's a proactive thing, again, it will be covered, but no, you wouldn't be required to go to people's houses.
Thank you, Tessa. Thank you so much. We're moving on now to our final speaker at Furley Page, Amanda Okill. Thank you, Amanda.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm just going to get my screen up. Okay. Welcome. Can everybody hear me okay? Just thumbs up if yes. Okay. I'm looking more at the practical sides now. We've heard some of the legal sides from Tessa and Andrew. I'm going to be looking at the practical side of hybrid working and some of the things that all of us would need to think of when we're implementing it. Because hybrid working, like anything, it does have very distinct challenges. And in principle, the right to work in a hybrid way from home or from partly from the office is great, but we need to think about how do we practically organize this particular right. And it's interesting when you look at introducing any new software or anything new to your members of staff, you've always got to train them in it. So for example, if you're having new IT systems, you will be training your staff in that. But with hybrid, often it was thrust on us really in the pandemic, and not a lot of thought was given into how this was actually worked out practically for different demographics in the workforce. Now, I'm going to be drawing on some sort of key themes and challenges for each of your organizations. The solutions or the way you do this will be different. So I'm not going to be preaching any particular style of doing it, but highlighting the practical challenges which we need to address when we're moving forward to a hybrid sort of style of working. And I thought it was actually useful to draw on some themes from lockdown, because we had a bit of a dry run with lockdown, and some key themes emerged. And I've been looking at this over the past year, and I've been doing some seminars during lockdown on some of the issues and the challenges that we faced last year. And I've noticed a few themes, and one of them that we've got to be mindful of is home working or hybrid working is just not suitable for everybody. It had a negative impact on certain members of staff. And if you're a manager with your staff or an HR manager, just think in your mind of some of the challenges last year you dealt with. For example, generally, if we look at the Office for National Statistics report, it's less suitable for younger workers. it's far more suitable for people over the age of 40, and many of those demographically were working in London area. So it was wealthier members of staff. Younger members of staff aged 20 to 24 were having far more difficulty working from home and adjusting to working from home. We also know from labour market statistics that wealthier a person is, the more likely they are to successfully work from home. We do know also from what I've seen is that, and this may have been the combination of home working with children, but it did have a negative impact on certain people's mental health. And a study was carried out by the Royal Society for Public Health. This is February 2021. And they found that 67%, so that's nearly 70% of staff interviewed found that home working had a negative effect on their mental health, and that they felt less connected with their colleagues. And it was harder to switch off. That's another thing that came out of the pandemic, that it's been harder to switch off. So we've got to accept that it's not going to suit everybody perfectly. So the big challenge is, how do we deal with this? And I would say, if there's one thing that everybody takes away from my section of the presentation, it sounds really simple, but it's the importance of communication with our staff. And key to that communication is communicating with empathy and listening. And listening means gauging your people's views and being able to reflect those views back to the people that you are communicating with. And it might sound a bit airy-fairy, but it's so important, because so many things I've seen over the years I've been practicing as an employment solicitor is relationships breaking down because of a lack of communication. Now we're entering into a new way of working, potentially, and communication is key. And on that note, I would, before starting out working on the hybrid system, sit down with individuals and ask them the question straight: do you have the facilities to work in a hybrid way? Are you living perhaps in a shared space? So if you're house sharing, it's going to be extremely difficult, not just because of the distractions from the people, but security reasons. Or are there people living with you who might make it difficult because you've got caring responsibilities? So you want to actually speak to people about whether they want to hybrid work, and if they have the facilities, both physical and social, to do so. And then once you've gathered that information, it's really important to speak to the teams, and to sit down one morning with your team that you're managing, if you are managing a team, and ask questions like, for example, an open question that we would recommend asking is, what are the challenges that we faced hybrid working during lockdown? And how can we make this? What are the potential risks that we've got moving forward? What are the challenges in satisfying our stakeholders, our other team members, other members in the company, and just making sure that we have an inclusive team while we're hybrid working. So with that in mind, what I'm going to be looking at now is preparing managers, because that's key, how to maintain a sense of team, some of the things to think about, and also adapting performance management systems. So with line managers, now line managers are key to the success of organizations. We do know that when they are the front face of the organization in communication. So if an organization introduces new policies or anything, it's the line managers that communicate. And a successful and happy relationship with a line manager is always, I've found, a key indicator of employee engagement. By engagement, I'm talking engagement you'll see in the CIPD and HR press, a lot of talk is on employee engagement. I'm talking about how enthusiastic employees are about their job, how dedicated they are, and how energized they are by their work. Now we've got to think, about how do we train managers and prepare line managers to deal with hybrid working. And so I was thinking, well, what themes emerged? What challenges did they face during the pandemic? And there's several things which have come out. First of all, line managers have been supporting their team's physical and mental well-being as well as their own. And this has been quite challenging for them on many levels. They've had to, for example, spot the signs of stress in their staff members working remotely, so they aren't able to pick up on subtle cues such as body language anymore. They've had to manage their own digital usage and that of their staff, and they might have had staff really struggling and distressed on the phone. So they will need training, and I would recommend in the future that line managers have well-being training to assist their staff in hybrid type of working. Performance management's been really good. Has it? It's a kind of a question we've got to think about. Has it been good in the pandemic? It's a big issue when you're used to performance managing people via visible signs. It's difficult. You've got to start thinking about moving to outcomes, to contribution, and to the value that employees are bringing in the team. So I would say that line managers will probably need some training on how to adapt and revisit their performance management systems. And I'll be just speaking a little bit about this at the end. They've had to also help support employees in utilising technology, getting up to speed on what we're doing now, for example, on using Zoom to communicate with clients and to communicate with each other, getting used to remote systems and training their staff in GDPR. The section that Tessa's been dealing with, it's critical for line managers to understand that. Because they will need to ensure that their team members are familiar with GDPR principles and are practicing it at home in order to mitigate against security risks. And finally, just another point, we've seen that line managers have had to consider issues of inclusion because, as I've mentioned, the needs of each team member differ. And it was interesting when I was reading up on this, and I came across an article written on the 8th of March, 2021, this year in the Financial Times. And the title of this article was, "I am close to quitting my career." And then it said, "Mothers step back from work to cope with pandemic parenting." And as many as 40% of career women, professional women, were considering taking a step back from their profession, from their career, because they were really struggling to cope, in comparison to 29% of men. So we know that this type of working, it doesn't always favour certain demographics. Women, ethnic minorities have struggled working remotely in the pandemic. And you've had people who've been able to come into the workspace and they've benefited from that, whereas other people have felt more and more disengaged. So you've got to think, how do we stop that environment developing in the future where the people who are in the office more are the people who progress? You can imagine an environment where more men are in the workplace, they just happen to be coming in, and you've got more women who opt for the hybrid type home working. Are you inadvertently facilitating a two-tier workforce where there's no collegiality? And these are things that we do need to train line managers on moving forward. The second thing I wanted to focus on is rebuilding. It's building a sense of team, but also rebuilding a sense of team. I've seen a lot of teams fractured when I've been talking to clients, as have my colleagues. They've been fractured because you have people who've been furloughed and people who haven't been furloughed, people who've been able to benefit from home working and those who haven't and might have been resentful, people who've had serious health conditions or have been looking after somebody who has a health condition at home and are just feeling a bit disenfranchised now. Now, a healthy team, if you think about what an effective team looks like, an effective team will be a team that's curious about learning about each other, and they're also proactive in their support for each other. And I just want you to take a moment here to reflect on not how your organization got this wrong, but to reflect on how your organization actually got team building right in the pandemic, with people working over dissipated spaces. And if anybody wants to drop some ideas in the chat box, I think that would be quite helpful for all of us, because I'm quite keen to develop this. It's a really important theme going forward. So anybody with any ideas you want to share, drop it in the chat box and Sue will share that with us. But just looking at some of the ways that we want to build a sense of team. We do know that people will be working maybe remotely or from a distance from home or different locations. And it's really important to still get occasions when you can meet face to face. People who've met face to face can establish that common sense of identity. If you only do it once every 6 months or once a year, and if that's the best that can happen, at least it's taking place. I would try and bring your teams face to face in a room on a regular basis, if at all possible, to see the positive, and then to hopefully you will see the positive effects of that. And that meeting, I would say, shouldn't just be a meet and greet, but you want to build in an icebreaker, and then you can discuss the clients, discuss the work, and then discuss silly things like your favorite TV show. What are you watching on Netflix? What books are you reading? How are your pets doing? What hobbies are you taking? Build that sense of team and identity, because that will make your unit a lot stronger moving forward. What you don't want is this dissipation and people competing with each other in a team, because that doesn't build an effective and strong team. I would also arrange regular virtual meetings with members of the team, one-to-one chats, coffee meetings, virtual coffee meetings, and virtual breakout rooms, so that team members can get to know each other. Make training a default, virtual training, the default position, so nobody's feeling excluded. So we get used to virtual training and everybody can be included in that way. And regular Zoom and Teams calls as well is going to be quite important in building the sense of team. And finally, I know this is, again, I feel like it's a whistle-stop tour, thinking about how do we develop talent right from the get-go, from inception, when you've recruited somebody and you're onboarding them. How do we develop that person at every stage of their career when we've got hybrid working? And you've got to ask yourself, is your organization ready for this? This is the question that you want to ask, is the current induction and performance management systems, are they fit for purpose in a hybrid environment? Has the performance appraisal system been revisited since the pandemic? And now that we're thinking of introducing hybrid working, have we monitored or modified this system since then? If it hasn't, now is really the time to do so. Now, there are some signs that your organization might not be ready for hybrid working, for developing career of your employees in hybrid working, if any of the following factors are prevalent. First of all, I was thinking, do you have an organizational culture that rewards presenteeism? If that's the case, it's probably not going to be quite ready for the hybrid style of working, and you will want to be addressing that. What about your learning and development activities? Are they, have they been facilitated and rebuilt for a virtual environment, or do they require people to attend in person? What about performance management systems? I mentioned that. Are they built on outcomes? Or are they still built on the visible signs of seeing how people interact in an office space? Have you got onboarding and induction built in? So those are the sort of things that we wanted to be thinking of. I know that I've come to the end of my time, and I just want to wish everybody every success with your introducing your hybrid working. Anybody has any questions? We've got some time now.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you very much. There was a question from Isabel earlier on, actually. Should the work equipment supplied by the company be insured by the employee's own contents insurance?
I suppose that's a question for me, isn't it? And my section.
Yes, yes.
Generally, as a general rule, it will be probably covered by the employer's insurance rather than the employees, because the employer owns it. But I would say check with your insurance, because as all insurance companies do, they are capitalizing on things like this. And if they're not covering it and the employee has to, you then have to think about, does their premium go up? Are you going to have to pay for it? Are there any obligations as well on you as an employer to check that equipment from time to time to ensure it carries on being insured? And what obligations are you required to tell your employees about keeping it securely and everything to ensure that insurance isn't void? So as a general rule, probably sits with the company insurance, but check whether there's any stipulations within there as to where it needs to be kept overnight.
Thank you. Thank you, that's great. There's been some good comments on how people are enjoying this session, and thank you very, very much indeed. I was just going to say regarding just in response to what Amanda was saying, one of the things that we do at the Chamber on a Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock is we have Friday games, and it's a really good opportunity for us to engage, find out how everyone's getting on, how the week's been and what they've got going on at the weekend. And it's a really good team building thing. I joined the Chamber during this, I'm based at home, I haven't met many people in person, and it's been a really great opportunity to get to know the team. So yeah, thank you very, very much. And everyone's got some good comments there, and thanking you very much. So thank you very, very much. It was good to see everybody engaged. We have been recording today, so if anybody wants to watch the session back, we will be able to send a link out to everybody. I'm going to very quickly hand over to Kelly, who's just going to tell you about some of our forthcoming events. Thank you,
Brilliant.
Kelly.
Brilliant, thank you, Sue, and thank you to Furley Page. That was fantastic. Really, really well delivered as well, and I'm sure everyone will be going away with some useful tips back to their businesses. Okay, so event-wise, tomorrow, I don't choose the events, by the way, but tomorrow we are doing a physical tour, our first one with the Chamber, and we're off to Biddenden Vineyard for wine tasting, hiccup. So yeah, please do come to that. It's going to be really good way to collaborate with other local businesses, and we will obviously be doing physical events round to other vineyards and breweries, just trying to support them because they've had a tough time, obviously, in during the pandemic. And we also have a question time with Damien Green. Now that is on the 24th of September, 8 o'clock till 9:30. That's going to be done via Zoom. And if for anyone who doesn't know, Damien Green is the MP of Ashford and the surrounding villages. So that will give you an opportunity to really speak about any concerns or anything you'd like to be seen to change in the district. Apart from that, I think that's enough now. We've done really well for time, so I'm not going to let it overrun. So I'll hand back over to you, Sue.
Thanks very much, Kelly. That's great. Please do try and come along to some of those events. They're very, very engaging and very interesting. Thank you, Furley Page, for a really engaging and informative session there. Really, really interesting. I've made loads of notes myself. Yeah, just thank you to everyone for coming and attending, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.